That is my mother.
Step away from the portrait.
Why is her face hanging in the Duke's private chamber?
Because some truths were never meant to leave this room.
I have known who you are since I was 17.
Then why did you hide it from me?
Because
I was trying to keep the truth from destroying you.
She should not have been there. The thought arrived too late, as most warnings do, after she had already crossed the threshold, already breathed in the cold cedar and stone air of the Duke of Harrington's private gallery, already taken 3 slow steps across the black marble floor that gleamed like a still lake at midnight, throwing her own pale face back at her in fragments. Elara Voss had cleaned 1,000 rooms in Ashford Palace. She had polished silver in corridors that most nobles would never bother to walk down, scrubbed floors in chambers that saw more secrets than sunlight, pressed and folded linen in the East Wing workrooms, while the palace clock struck hours she had long since stopped registering. 8 months of quiet, diligent, unremarkable work. 8 months of being the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it, which had suited her purposes so precisely that she had come to think of her own invisibility as a kind of tool. She knew the particular silence that lived in places where powerful people kept the things they did not want discovered. It had a texture to it, thick, pressurized, the silence of things that had been waiting a very long time and were growing tired of it. She knew the feeling of trespassing. She had never done it. Until tonight. The gallery door had been unlocked. That was the detail she kept returning to. The fact she had used to justify the crossing of a line she had spent 8 months being careful never to approach. She had noticed it 3 days ago while delivering pressed linen to the Duke's steward. The brass handle sitting slightly ajar, a crack of warm amber light spilling into the servants' corridor like something that had lost its way. She had looked away, completed her delivery, walked back to the East Wing workroom and folded 12 sets of bed linen with the focused attention of a woman who was absolutely not thinking about anything else. But the crack of light had followed her to sleep. She had told herself it was curiosity. That was the simplest thing to tell herself, and the most respectable. She told herself that a seamstress with no title, no inheritance, and a dead mother whose face she was slowly, helplessly forgetting, had every right to steal one moment of beauty in a palace so full of it that the beauty itself had grown complacent. She told herself a great many things. Not one of them was the true thing, and she knew it. The true thing was her mother. The true thing was a letter discovered 3 years ago at the bottom of Elara Voss's old sewing chest, in the cold, grinding week after the funeral, when Elara had forced herself to sort through the things no one else was going to sort for her. The letter was written in a hand that was almost familiar, but not quite. Older, more formal. The letters arranged at an angle she did not know. It bore a seal in deep red wax, a running stag held together by the wax's own authority. And it was addressed to a name she had never once heard used for her mother in 22 years of living beside her. Lady Helena Montclair. Not Voss, not Helena of Greyvale. Montclair. She had carried that name like a stone in her pocket for 3 years, turning it over in spare moments, pressing it until it had worn smooth. She had not been able to read the letter. The language was archaic and formal, older than anything she'd been taught. She had not been able to have it translated, because having it translated required trust, and trust required knowing what she was trusting someone with, and she had not yet worked that out. So she had carried it, and she had come here, to the capital, to Ashford Palace, on a linen worker's contract she had applied for with reasons she had not entirely examined. Montclair was an old name. Eastern Territories. Old money, old land, old standing. The kind of name attached to estates and armorial registers and, presumably, the portrait galleries of powerful men who had married into it or presided over the destruction of it. She had not known what she was looking for when she came to this palace. She had hoped she would know it when she found it. She found it at the far end of the gallery, between 2 tall windows draped in midnight blue velvet, in a gilded frame so ornate it seemed to be making an argument about its own importance. The portrait was 6 feet from the floor to the carved crown of its frame. The woman within it was young, 19 perhaps, or barely 20, seated in a high-backed chair upholstered in forest green, her dark hair arranged in elaborate coils at the nape of her neck. Her gown was deep crimson, the precise shade of wine held close to firelight, and at her throat she wore rubies that caught the lamp's glow the way only very old stones catch light, with the authority of things that have been beautiful for longer than any single person's lifetime and know it. The painter had arranged her in the formal, stiff posture of official commission, and yet her face resisted the arrangement. There was something in the particular tilt of her head, a quality in the dark eyes, that suggested the instant the painter turned away this woman would have let her shoulders drop entirely, would have tucked her feet up onto the chair, would have said something dry and precisely observed that made everyone in the room laugh before they'd quite intended to. Elara recognized this quality. She had watched it her whole childhood, had loved it, had missed it every single day for 3 years. And the hands. The hands folded in the portrait subject's lap, left over right, with the specific naturalness of someone who always folded her hands that way without being told to. The way Elara's mother had always held her hands, the way Elara held her own hands without thinking. Left over right, a habit she had never traced to its origin until this exact moment, standing in a locked gallery at midnight, looking at the origin of everything. The woman in the portrait was her mother, not the Helena she had grown up beside, not the Helena of Greyvale and lavender and folk songs and other people's mending done by lamplight for coins that were never quite enough. This was a Helena she had never met, and meeting her now, 20 years too late, in a gilded frame in the forbidden gallery of a man whose name Elara had not known 3 years ago, felt like something tearing and something being restored at the same time, in the same breath, without warning. Helena in rubies, Helena in crimson. Helena painted by someone who was paid very well to make sure she was remembered exactly like this. Elara's hand lifted toward the frame before she had decided to lift it. "What are you doing in here?" She spun. The guard in the doorway was broad through the shoulder and wore the Harrington household livery. Silver and black, the colors of a family that had spent 2 centuries making sure everyone knew exactly who they were dealing with. He had a companion, and behind them both, the flutter of more torchlight in the corridor. Her heart had departed her body. She could feel it still standing near the portrait, staring at her mother's hands. "This gallery is restricted," the guard said. "You are in violation of the household ordinance. Come with me." She came. The room they put her in was wrong in the most specific way, not a cell. She had prepared herself for a cell, had worked through it in the corridor on the way here, building the shape of what was coming. Stone floor, iron door, formal dismissal from the palace, contract forfeited, 8 months of quiet, careful work dissolved in one night's foolishness. She had made a kind of peace with that version of events. She had decided it was survivable. Instead, a room with a settee upholstered in rose damask, a fire already burning in the grate as though someone had anticipated her arrival, a small side table bearing a water pitcher and 2 crystal glasses, 2, she noted, as though company was expected, and a window that looked out over the formal garden where the topiary hunting birds stood in the moonlight like patient, dark-winged things. The door locked from the outside. That part was consistent with her expectations. The rest of it was not. She stood in the center of the room for a long time, listening. The fire breathed. The clock in the corridor struck 11, then the quarter past, then the half. She watched the topiary birds outside the window and thought about her mother and rubies, and about the sealed letter in the old sewing chest that she'd brought to the capital and kept in the lining of her second coat, and about the name Montclair, which had been sitting in her pocket for 3 years, waiting to mean something. She had been in this palace 8 months. She had been so careful. She had built her information in pieces small enough that no single piece looked like what it was. A conversation with the archivist's assistant about household genealogies in general, about noble families of the Eastern Territories in particular. A few afternoons with the head cook's daughter, who knew every servant's gossip and had never thought to wonder why Elara was curious about certain family histories. An hour in the public register, looking at armorial records, tracing the running stag of the Montclair crest to its origin in the eastern earldoms 300 years ago. She had assembled the outline of a story whose center she had not yet found, until an hour ago. Until she had found the center hanging in a gilded frame at the end of a gallery she had no right to enter, and had recognized it instantly, and had reached for it. She sat down on the rose damask settee and folded her hands in her lap, left over right, and waited. The door opened at 1:15. Duke Aldrich Harrington was taller in life than his public appearances had suggested. She had seen him twice at formal palace events, always at a distance, always processed through the lens of the deference that surrounded him. The slight reorganization of bodies that happened whenever he moved through a room, the way spaces opened for him as a matter of course. Distance converted powerful men into their titles. Up close he was in his early 50s with silver threading through dark hair at his temples, and a face that had been very handsome once and had been refined by time and power and perhaps other things into something past. Handsome, something severe and functional, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. He moved the way men move when they have never once been required to wait for a door to open for them. He dismissed the guards with a gesture so small she almost missed it, and then he looked at her. The looking undid every careful arrangement she had made of herself. She had braced for assessment, the cold, efficient appraisal of a powerful man deciding how to deal with an inconvenient servant. She knew what that looked like. She had been on the receiving end of it many times in 22 years, and had learned to meet it without flinching, without changing her face, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her understand what she was being measured against. This was entirely different. Duke Aldrich Harrington looked at her the way a man looks at a ghost, like something that has no logical right to be standing in the room he is standing in, like the world has made an error and failed to inform him, and he is now required to process that error in real time, in front of a witness, without the preparation he would have preferred. The mask, and it was a mask. She understood this now with the clarity that comes from spending 8 months, learning to notice things, sealed back so quickly over the fracture that she could nearly have imagined it hadn't happened. Nearly. What is your name? Elara. Elara Voss. A single tremor crossed his face, controlled immediately, buried. How long have you been in the palace? 8 months. I work in the linen rooms. Standard contract through the registry. Who arranged your placement? I applied directly. Silence. The fire shifted and resettled. She watched him recalibrate, watched the mask do the work it was built to do, and beneath the watching felt the strange duality of a person who has been looking for something for 3 years and is now, suddenly and irrevocably, very close to it. You saw the portrait, he said. Yes. And? The woman in it looked like my mother? Another silence, long enough for the half-hour to strike in the corridor, long enough for the fire to breathe in and out 3 times while he stood looking at her with that expression she could not name but would not forget. He turned away, walked to the window, looked out at the garden and the topiary birds, and the moonlight on things that had no way of knowing they were being looked at. Wait here, he said. He went to the door. It opened before he reached it. The man who came through the door had not knocked, and he did not look surprised by anything he found. Not by the Duke caught mid-stride, not by Elara on the settee with her hands folded and her face carefully arranged, not by the water pitcher and its 2 glasses, or the fire, or the general atmosphere of a situation with considerably more layers than its surface suggested. He moved into the room with the ease of someone for whom arrival is itself a sufficient announcement. He was perhaps 26. His coat was the dark blue-black of deep water, and he wore it with the unself-consciousness of someone who has never had to decide whether clothes suited them because the question had never been relevant. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, but he carried himself with a quality of presence that made the room smaller when he entered it, not oppressively, but in the way that a fire makes a room smaller, by drawing the eye, by becoming the thing everything else orients toward without being asked. His face was in constant subtle motion, reading everything in the room at once. Dark hair, a jaw with the kind of line that painters tried to capture and only partially succeeded at, and his eyes, when they moved across the room and found Elara, were the gray of a sky in the 3 minutes before a storm decides what it's going to do. She recognized him. Prince Caspian Ashford, Crown Prince of the Ashford Kingdom, heir apparent, second most powerful person in the room. She was currently locked inside. Here, looking at her, not surprised. You found her, he said, and he said it to the Duke, which meant he had known she was here before he walked in. Had known and had come deliberately. The Duke's expression moved through several complicated registers quickly. How did you know to come here? I told you 8 months ago that she had applied to the employment registry. I told you we should allow the placement. Caspian moved further into the room, with the smoothness of a current redirecting around an obstacle. He positioned himself at the room's center, his back half-angled to the Duke, his attention fully on Elara. Not quite a barrier. Something more precise than a barrier. A presence deliberately interposed between 2 things. She is under my observation, he said, and the quiet in his voice had the specific quality of something that has simply decided to stop requiring volume and become inevitable instead. Stand down, Aldrich, the Duke's first name, on the Crown Prince's tongue. Elara noted it. The Duke noted that she noted it. He left. The door closed. In the sudden quiet, Elara became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, which had relocated somewhere near her throat, and was making itself known with more insistence than was useful. "You are not in trouble," Caspian said. He turned fully toward her, and the controlled quality of his expression adjusted itself, did not disappear but softened, the way a lamp turned down from its brightest setting still gives light, but no longer burns. "Whatever you have spent the last hour preparing yourself for, it isn't that. Then what is it?" He regarded her. He looked at her face with the specific attentiveness of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for, and is finding it. Now, in the particular arrangement of her features, and the particular way she held her hands. She had the disorienting sensation of being recognized, rather than merely seen, which were not the same thing at all. "Sit down," he said, "please." He pulled a chair across the space between them and sat in it with his forearms on his knees, the formal court posture entirely abandoned, for a conversation rather than a proceeding. "What I have to tell you will take some time, and it is going to change a great many things." She sat. "The woman in that portrait was not your father's wife before she became your mother," he said. "Her birth name was not Voss, it was Montclair." Elara's breath came slow and careful. "She was Lady Helena Montclair," he continued, "daughter of the Earl of Montclair, one of the oldest families in the Eastern Territories. She was 19 years old when she married Aldrich Harrington, lawfully, in the parish church of Selmere, 24 years ago. The marriage was registered, it was witnessed, it was real." He paused. He was giving her time. She was grateful for it, and said nothing. "She was his wife," Elara said, finally. "His first wife, and she was carrying his child when she fled this palace. The fire, the clock in the corridor, the sound of her own breath, which had become the loudest thing in the room. 'I am the child,' she said. Yes. She absorbed it the way you absorb a fall from a height you hadn't known you were standing at. Not with understanding, not immediately, but with the body's full recognition that something structural has changed, that the map of things requires fundamental redrawing, and that the redrawing will take longer than this moment, but the moment is where it begins. Why did she run? Because someone made it very dangerous for her not to." He reached into his coat and produced a letter. Old, the paper gone soft with age and handling, the seal broken long ago. He placed it on the table between them. She recognized her mother's handwriting before she had consciously registered what she was looking at. Left slanted, slightly cramped, the particular formation of her lowercase letters like small inverted cups. The opening line visible from where she sat. "My darling, if you are reading this, then I did not survive what is coming." Elara's hand moved toward it. The door crashed open. 5 men in Harrington silver and black. At the front, the Duke's private secretary Croft, a small, precise, gray-suited man who had always watched Elara with a wariness she had put down to standard household suspicion. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at the letter on the table, and he was moving toward it. Caspian's hand moved first. Faster than physics seemed to permit for a man seated in a low chair, faster than Croft's fingers by the precise margin of someone who had anticipated this exact moment. The letter disappeared into his coat. Croft's hand arrived at the empty table. Croft looked at the prince. The prince looked back with the expression of a man who has all the time there is. "You should leave," Caspian said. More men were visible in the corridor. A great many more. Caspian rose from his chair slowly, without urgency. He was taller standing, taller and broader than the seated posture had suggested, with the economy of movement of someone who never expends more than is necessary. He turned to Elara. "Do not trust anyone in this palace tonight," he said, quietly. Directly. Not a performance, not a warning designed to be overheard, but a plain fact delivered to a specific person who needed it. Not until this is resolved, no one. He turned back to the corridor full of men. "You will take me to Aldrich," he said. Now. They parted for him. They always did. The door closed. Elara sat alone with the fire and the locked door and the empty place on the table where the letter had been, and the full rearranging weight of the words "his first wife," and she carried, and all the enormous quiet things those words made true and untrue simultaneously. What happened next moved faster than she was prepared for. She heard it before she saw it. Voices in the corridor, raised and declarative in the way of people who did not normally raise their voices, and beneath them another one, quieter than the rest, that somehow carried further than all of them. The door was unlocked from the outside. First the Duke's steward, bowing and stepping aside. Then Duke Aldrich, his composure more intact than she might have expected, though she could see the cost of it now, the rigidity in his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has spent his entire available reserve of control just getting to this room. Then Prince Caspian, with a leather case that a palace archivist carried one step behind him, and something in Caspian's face she had not seen there before. Not anger exactly, but the quality of a man who has been waiting for a very long time, and has now, finally, run out of reasons to wait any longer. Then 3 members of the royal household in deep blue and gold. Then, in the doorway, filling it with a presence that was less about physical size than about the absolute weight of 4 decades of authority, King Edmund Ashford himself. Elara stood. The king was 60 and looked it, and also looked like the kind of 60 that has been properly used. Refined, stripped to what was essential, the way a good blade is stripped by years of real use until nothing remains but function. He looked at Elara with the calm of someone who has spent 40 years reading complicated rooms and finds that they remain, fundamentally, honest to a patient eye. He looked at his son. "Well," the king said, a complete sentence. 2 years, Caspian said, not the opening of something. The entirety of what he had to say about the time it had taken to arrive here. 2 words that carried the weight of 8 years, and Elara heard all of it. He opened the leather case. He produced the original parish registry from Selmere, not a copy, not a later reproduction, but the priest's own record on paper that had gone brown at its edges with age. The marriage of Aldrich James Harrington and Helena Rosemont Clare, 24 years ago, in a handwriting so deliberate, it seemed to understand it was making something permanent. He produced her mother's letter. He produced 3 more documents, correspondence between the Duke's household and a legal firm in the capital, written in language that was careful and deniable and, in the end, not careful or deniable enough when read by someone with 2 years of context and a complete picture. He produced a medical record. He set this last one on the table face down, and before he turned it over, he looked at Elara with an expression that was the closest she had yet seen him come to apology. "This is an apothecary's record from Greyvale," he said. "The record of a compound dispensed, over a period of years, to a customer presenting under a false name." A pause. "In small doses over time, this compound does not kill. It debilitates. It weakens the constitution systematically, the lungs especially. Taken over years, administered with consistency and care, it produces exactly what any physician seeing a poor woman in a market town would call a constitutional weakness. The kind of slow fading that the poor are understood to do, without anyone looking closely enough to ask why." He turned the record over. Elara sat down. She sat down because her body understood something before her mind had finished processing it, and she did not argue. The fire was still there. The king was still there. The documents on the table were still there. But the room had gone briefly remote, the way things go remote, when the mind is being asked to hold something that is larger than the space it usually uses for holding things. Her mother had not been ill. Her mother had not simply faded, had not been taken by hardship and bad luck, and the ordinary cruelty of poverty. Her mother had been given something, by someone who had known where she was, had had the resources and the patience to arrange it, and had had the coldness to continue arranging it across the full span of Elara's childhood, while Elara sat at the kitchen table with the lavender in the window boxes and did not know, and could not have known, and had simply watched her mother get quieter and more tired and less able to breathe without understanding that the quietness and the tiredness had been administered to her, carefully, from outside. "Cecilia, arrange the compound," Caspian said. "I have the correspondence." Every head in the room turned. Lady Cecilia Harrington had appeared in the doorway at some point in the previous minutes without anyone noticing her arrival, which was, Elara would later think, entirely characteristic. She was 45 and beautiful in the way of things that are very deliberately and very consistently maintained, hair a perfect silver blonde, gown the pale gray of early fog, expression the expression of a woman who finds the current situation more tedious than threatening. Her smile was exactly in place. It was always exactly in place. "What a remarkable performance," Cecilia said, and walked into the room with the ease of a woman who has never been in a room she wasn't the most important person in. "Letters can be forged, Your Highness. Registries can be altered. The grief of a young woman who has lost her mother can produce the need for meaning where none exists, and those who care for her will follow her there. Her eyes moved to Elara with the cold precision of someone assessing a variable they have been monitoring for a long time. This is a compelling story. It is still only a story. From the case her own secretary held, she produced a document, a single sheet, bearing a notary's seal and a signature. Elara Voss, she said, placing the surname with deliberate care, formally relinquished all claims arising from any prior arrangement. For herself and for any issue, her own words, her own signature, in full legal form. She set the paper on the table with the composure of a woman who is playing her highest card and knows it. The matter was resolved by the woman herself, as her own free choice. The room was very still. Elara looked at the signature. She looked at it for a long time, long enough for the fire to settle, long enough for the clock to move through a full minute. She was aware of every eye in the room finding her face, waiting. She was aware of Caspian, slightly to her left, absolutely still in the specific way of someone who already knows what is about to happen. She said, very quietly, "My mother was left-handed." Cecilia's smile did not move. "She was left-handed her entire life, every letter she ever wrote me. Every note she left on the kitchen table before I was old enough to read. Every label on every jar in the pantry. She was precise about labels. She said it was important to know what things actually were. Every page in the household account books that I brought to this palace in the lining of my coat when I came, because her handwriting was one of the last things I had that was completely and only hers." She looked up from the document. She met Cecilia's eyes with the steadiness of a person who has just understood a very large thing, and who is deciding, in real time, what to do with it, but knows with absolute certainty that looking away is not one of the options. That signature was made by a right hand, the smile. It held for perhaps 3 seconds, and then it cracked. Not the dramatic collapse of stage villains, not tears or trembling. The crack of a mask that has been worn too long and finally at last fails. A hairline fracture, barely visible, and yet once seen, impossible to unsee. The composure was still present. The thing it had been protecting was not. King Edmund set down the document he had been reviewing. He turned to look at Duke Aldrich with the look of a man who has served his kingdom for 40 years and has made a long peace with the fact that it will sometimes require him to do very difficult things. The Duke did not speak again. He nodded, once, with the weight of a verdict. Elara lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Majesty. Helena Montclair's daughter," he said. Not a question. The acknowledgement of a fact, placed into the room with the permanence of something being entered into a record. Then he looked at Elara, and what she saw in his face was not pity, which she had feared, and not the cold calculation of political consequence, which she had half expected. It was something older and simpler than either. It was the look of a man who has been shown a wrong that happened in his kingdom and is deciding, in front of witnesses, that it will be made right. The king stood for a long time after that, looking at the documents on the table with the particular stillness of a man who has seen a great many things in 40 years of reign and has learned to let the full weight of each one land before he moves. Elara watched him and did not speak. No one spoke. The formal proceedings were not fast, and she had not expected them to be. The Ashford court moved with the deliberateness of something that intended to last. Every claim documented, witnessed, sealed, entered into the permanent record, cross-referenced and verified by 2 independent parties before it was treated as settled. Elara learned this over the days that followed, watching from what felt like the edge of her own life as that life was reconstructed in documents she had never known existed. The Duke was detained at the palace in the manner of someone whose household accounts required urgent external auditing. Cecilia was detained in a different wing and in considerably less comfortable terms. A herald went to Selmere for the parish priest's personal attestation. A second team went to Greyvale for the apothecary's full records and the household documents of Elara Voss, formerly Montclair. A third was dispatched to the Eastern Territories, where an elderly Montclair cousin, who had spent 20 years not knowing where Helena was, received the news of her death and the existence of her daughter in a letter that took 3 drafts to write. Elara was given a room on the 3rd floor with windows that faced east, a fire that stayed lit, a door that locked from the inside at her own choice. She sat in that room on the first night with her mother's letter in her hands. It was 7 pages long. Helena had written it knowing she might not reach the other side of what was coming. She had written in the left slanted hand that Elara would know in a room of 100,000 signatures, in the voice she used when it was only the 2 of them, when there was no one to perform composure for. I am sorry for the silence and the secrecy, and for every year you lived without knowing the full truth of where you came from. I kept your name hidden to keep you alive. The moment you were known, you became a target, and I would have lived in that small house in Greyvale for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of mending other people's torn things for coins that were never quite enough. If it meant you were not a target, you are a Montclair and a Harrington, and both of those things are complicated, and I am sorry for that too. But you are more yourself than you are any name. You always have been. From the moment you were born, you came into the world with an opinion about it, and the opinion showed in your face before you could speak, and I have loved you so fiercely for it that the love has sometimes frightened me. There is one man who knows the truth. I gave proof to one of his messengers in the market square in Greyvale years ago because I believed he was the kind of person who does not set things aside when it is inconvenient to carry them. I do not know when the time will come for you to know all of this. I only know it will come. Trust him when he tells you. Not because he is powerful. Power is never hard to find in the right rooms. Trust him because he chose to know. That is always the harder thing. On the 7th page, near the end, Helena had written, "I would have given anything to see you grown, my darling. I believe I am going to have to give this instead. Take it. Use it. You were always braver than you knew." Elara folded the letter on the 7th page. She held it between both hands, left over right. She sat with it until the fire had burned to its embers and the clock struck 3 in the palace's corridors, and the great quiet of a place that has been very loud and is catching its breath settled around her like something deliberate. Caspian came alone in the hour before dawn. No guards, no archivist, no leather case. Just himself in the low blue light before the palace stirred, looking tired in the way that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the kind of tired that builds over a long time and cannot be resolved in a single night's sleep. He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair as before, the angle of a conversation, and for a moment said nothing. She had begun to recognize this about him, that his silences were not the silences of someone with nothing to say, but of someone making room for the weight of what they were about to say. She found it, unexpectedly, a quality she trusted. "My mother wrote about you," Elara said, before he could find his first word. "She didn't use your name. She said there was a man who knew the truth, that she'd given proof to one of his messengers, and that I should trust him because he chose to know. She said that was always the harder thing." He looked at his hands. When he looked back up, the mask, the public face, the managed face, the face he wore in corridors and proceedings and throne rooms, was not quite in place. Something in it had shifted in the hours since she had last seen him, opened slightly at the seams. "I was 17, he said. My father's messenger was delivering a routine correspondence to the magistrate in Greyvale. A woman approached him in the market. She pressed a folded document into his hands and told him it needed to reach the Crown Prince's personal records, not the palace archive, not the household registry, specifically my personal records. The messenger told me when he reported back that he was fairly certain she was unwell. But you looked at what she gave him." "I looked at it. I read the names. I read the date and the parish notation and the priest's attestation at the bottom, and I sat with it for a long time, because I was 17 and I understood that what I was holding was either nothing at all, or something that would require more patience than I had yet developed, and more care than I knew yet how to give. A pause. I have never been able to set something down once I understand what it is. It is not a virtue. It is simply a quality I have, like the way some people cannot leave a room without checking the window. 8 years, she said. The Duke has influence in every part of the apparatus that would need to verify what I had found. Every time I moved with any speed, something disappeared. An archivist retired. A document was misfiled in a way that made it unlocatable. A witness suddenly found their recollection imprecise. He said it without bitterness, as a recitation of conditions, the way a navigator describes weather. I learned that this particular work required a patience that did not come to me naturally. I built it, slowly, with several false starts that cost months each. When did you know about me? The registry listed your mother as Helena Harrington at the time of the marriage. When I traced her to Greyvale, I found the record of a daughter born 8 months after the date she would have fled the palace. I knew your name. He looked at her steadily. I had a portrait sketch made of you. A traveling artist who passed through Greyvale when you were perhaps 16. working from the descriptions of people in the market who knew you. I carried it for 2 years before you came to the capital." Elara was quiet for a moment. "You had a portrait of me," she said. "For 2 years, yes. And when I applied to the employment registry, you arranged the placement. The contract I thought I'd won on my own merits. I needed you in this palace, somewhere I could manage the immediate environment when the evidence was finally complete enough to withstand challenge. I needed to know where you were." He met her eyes. "I am fully aware of how that sounds." "It sounds," she said precisely, "like a prince who made significant decisions about my life without once consulting me about any of them." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it was." She sat with the anger that lived in that. It was clean anger, honest and legitimate. The anger of a person who has discovered that the story they believed they were the author of had, in fact, been arranged by someone else. She felt it fully. She did not apologize for it or perform otherwise. And beneath the anger, she sat with the other thing. A 17-year-old boy who had received a frightened woman's parish registry in a provincial market square and had not set it aside. 8 years of building a case against one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, moving slowly and without allies who could safely be trusted, rebuilding from scratch a patience he hadn't naturally possessed because the work required it, keeping her safe by keeping her close and never announcing himself. The invisible, careful, unseen work of someone who had decided that an inconvenient truth was still a truth and deserved the same careful handling as any other. He chose to know. "You said you came close to telling me yourself," she said. Something shifted in his expression. The remaining formality in it gave way, and what was underneath was considerably more honest than anything the night's long and complicated proceedings had produced. "In the East Wing corridor on a Thursday evening in February, in the garden during the winter festival, you were standing near the fountain and it was snowing lightly, and I came within 3 words of walking directly to you. In the library, twice, in the back corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, when you were carrying a basket of pressed linen and singing something quietly to yourself that I didn't recognize, and I stopped walking and stood in the storage room doorway for 4 full minutes, and then you turned the corner and I let you go." She looked at him. 4 minutes. "I introduced myself to you in my head approximately 900 times, he said, with the dry precision of someone reporting an embarrassing arithmetic fact. "In reality, I never got further than your name, because I knew that once I introduced the rest of it, you would be in danger, and the evidence was not yet complete, and—" He paused. "And," he said, quieter now, "without any of the management, I was already aware that objectivity about you was not something I was capable of, and the work required objectivity, and I could not afford to begin something I couldn't manage properly." The pale blue of pre-dawn was at the window. The fire had gone to coals. "You could not afford to begin something," she said slowly, "because you had feelings about me that you were aware of. Yes, for some time, for a considerable time. Based on a portrait sketch and a church registry. Based on, over time, considerably more than that. But yes, it began there," she thought. "Steady and particular," she thought. "That is what you are too," she thought. "My mother saw it from the market square in Greyvale, in the quality of the man who would receive her proof and carry it. The directness of it surprised her. She had expected deflection, or the careful management of an admission. She had not expected the plain acknowledgement of something that cost him to admit. "Yes," he said, before she had finished, simply, without dressing it up. "It was. It wasn't only inconvenient for me," she said. "What you couldn't do. It must have been—" She thought that must have been its own kind of difficult. She thought that was worth saying. She looked at him for a long time in the pale pre-dawn light. She looked at the face that was not the public face, the one that did not manage itself. She thought about her mother's words on the 7th page. Trust him because he chose to know. She thought about the specific loneliness of a person who has been carrying a secret that belongs to someone else, watching that person from a distance, unable to speak, for 8 years. She thought about the Tuesday afternoon in the back corridor, about the 4 minutes, about a man who had stood in a storage room doorway and counted the seconds and then let her turn the corner and walked away from it, again because the work still required it. She thought about her mother's words on the 7th page. "He chose to know," she said. "I think you have 8 years' worth of conversations you owe me." The expression that moved across his face then was not the Crown Prince's face. It was the other one, the one she had begun to recognize, the one that had nothing to do with performance or management or the presentation of power. The face of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just been told, quietly and with certainty, that the waiting is finished. "I have," he said, "approximately 900 introductions prepared." She laughed, a real one. Surprised out of her, not polite, not social, the kind you cannot plan for. He watched her laugh with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Unguarded, warm, tilted toward something that was very close to delight. The crown prince, for one unmanaged moment, entirely absent. She reached out her hand across the small, firelit distance between them. He took it. Outside the east-facing windows, the palace's first birds began. She appeared before the court on the morning of the third day. She had not imagined this, had not planned it in her mind's detail the way people plan the moments they believe are coming for them. She had spent 3 years carrying the vague shape of a truth she didn't have the full text of, and imagining the moment of its resolution had felt, somehow, presumptuous. Like drawing the ending of a story you hadn't been given leave to finish. So she arrived at the receiving hall with only what she had. She was her mother's daughter. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in a market town and mended other people's things for a living, and come to this palace on a linen worker's contract, and found, in a locked gallery at midnight, the thing she had not known she was looking for until she was looking directly at it. She wore dark blue wool, simply cut. She had thought carefully about this. She wanted to look like herself. Not like a performance, not like a claim. Like herself. The signet ring had been presented to her that morning. The Harrington firstborn's ring. Heavy gold with a black onyx face, and the Harrington stag in bas-relief, warm from the legal officer's hand. She had held it. She had turned it over in her palm and felt the weight of it. She had thought about her mother in a small house in Greyvale, mending other people's things for coins, growing quieter every year. She carried the ring to the table at the center of the room. She set it down. She did not put it on. 200 people were quiet. "I am Helena Montclair's daughter," she said. Her voice carried the way her mother's had always carried. Not loudly, but with the quality of something that knows what it is and does not require volume to be heard. "I don't want a title that was hidden from me as a weapon. I don't intend to be anyone's heir if the inheritance comes wrapped in everything that brought this room together this morning." She paused. She let it settle. "What I want is my mother's name restored to the permanent record of this kingdom. Her marriage documented and sealed and entered alongside everything else that is considered permanent here. Her story, which this court, and this household, and the people who served its interests actively worked to erase. Told aloud, in this room, by the people who were part of the erasing. That is what I am here for." 200 people were very still. She looked at the Duke at the room's far end, studying his hands with the careful focus of a man who has decided his hands are the most interesting thing available to him. She looked at where Cecilia was not. She looked at the king, who was watching her with something that was, she thought, not entirely unlike the recognition she had felt from Caspian the night he first looked at her across the firelit room. She looked at Caspian. He was in his formal position to the left of the king's chair, slightly behind and to the side, the correct and designated angle of readiness. He was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that she was learning the way you learn a landscape you mean to live in. Not by memorizing it, but by spending time in it, until it becomes familiar without effort. His face held its public composure, and then it didn't. She watched his jaw shift. She watched the controlled quality of his expression soften in that small, private, entirely genuine way she had learned to look for. She suspected most of the room could not see it. She had learned to see it. He stepped forward. 5 strides across the stone floor, unhurried. He went down on one knee in front of her. The hall exhaled. Not the exhalation of protocol. Not the formal acknowledgement of a rank or a title. The other kind, the kind that does not have a protocol assigned to it, because it does not belong to hierarchy or ceremony. It belongs to one specific person, kneeling in front of another specific person, because they have run out of every other form of saying the thing that needs to be said, and this is the last honest one left. "I have known who you were since I was 17 years old," he said, not managing the room, not performing for the audience behind them, looking up at her with the face that was not the public face. "I have spent 8 years making sure that when you found out who you were, it would not destroy you. I am fully aware that this is not, as yet, a romantic story." A small pause. "I am also aware that I am on my knee in the center of the receiving hall in front of the full court, which was not scheduled for this morning. A sound moved through the hall that was distinctly a laugh. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would allow me the opportunity to make it one." Elara looked down at him. She thought about her mother, about grey veil and lavender and 7 pages of left-handed writing, and a line near the end. "You were always braver than you knew." She thought about a 17-year-old boy who had received a stranger's church registry and had not set it aside. She thought about 4 minutes in a storage room doorway in the East Wing corridor on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She reached down and took his hand. He stood. They were close in the way the hall's formal architecture had never been designed to accommodate, and his hand was warm around hers, and his face was doing something that had nothing to do with composure or the management of public moments. It was the face of someone who has been patient for a very long time, and is grateful, and is not entirely succeeding at keeping the gratitude contained. She said quietly, for only him, "You have 8 years' worth of conversations you owe me." "I have," he said, "exactly 900 introductions prepared." She laughed. He smiled. The real smile, the one that rearranged his face entirely, that made the crown prince, for one full, unguarded moment, simply a man who was very glad to be standing exactly where he stood. The hall, behind them, understood that it had witnessed something it would be talking about for a very long time. Elara thought about that choice for a long time before she understood it. She was not certain, even once she understood it, that she agreed with it. But she kept the understanding close, in the way you keep the things that complicate your grief, not resolved, not gone, but present, real. She thought about her mother in grey veil, who had worn a different kind of mask for 22 years. Not the mask of someone hiding power, but the mask of someone making powerlessness livable. Elara Voss, who grew lavender and hummed songs without names and told her daughter that some things were better left buried, and had meant, by it, that she loved her daughter more than she loved justice, and had made her choice accordingly. She did not see Cecilia again for a long time after that night. She did not particularly wish to. But she thought about her, in the way you think about something you have looked directly at, and cannot entirely unsee. Cecilia's face as the smile finally broke, the 3 seconds in which it held past its limit, and then simply failed. The hairline fracture of a mask worn too long. The formal proceedings took months, as the Ashford court's proceedings always did. The Duke's situation resolved through the court's mechanisms with the thorough, permanent thoroughness the court applied to everything it chose to be thorough about. Lady Cecilia's situation resolved with considerably more urgency and considerably more gravity, and took up rather less of the court gazette's columns, for reasons that were not publicly discussed but were privately understood. The Montclair name was restored to the royal record in full. Helena Rose Montclair, wife of the Duke of Harrington. Her marriage entered into the kingdom's permanent registry, sealed and witnessed. The names of those who had been part of erasing it formally attached to the restoration as a condition of the settlement. Her story was told aloud, in the receiving hall, by the people Elara had asked to tell it. She listened to every word. Elara did not take the Harrington title. She spent the months of proceedings in the palace and came to know it differently than she had known it as a linen worker. Not as a series of corridors to be cleaned and rooms to be made invisible in, but as a place that, it turned out, had a great many things to recommend it when you were permitted to simply be present in it. She and Caspian walked in the gardens, which she could now see properly, in daylight, without the stable roof window between her and them. She found that he could argue a point of law for 45 minutes, without repeating himself, that he had a particular and unreasonable attachment to a very old battered chronicle of the Eastern Territories that he had read often enough to cite from memory, and that he was considerably better in a kitchen than anyone in the palace had known about or would have expected, with opinions about the consistency of pastry that he held with the same conviction he brought to matters considerably more consequential. He learned that she could identify the origin of a woven fabric by touch alone, that she had her mother's quality of precise observation, the gift of noticing the specific thing, the detail that mattered, the left-handed signature in a room full of people who had missed it, that she laughed with her whole face when something genuinely struck her as funny, not the polished social laugh she deployed for situations that required one, that she had spent 22 years becoming very good at being invisible and was going to have to learn, quite deliberately, how to be otherwise. He helped her learn it. He pointed out, with patience and without performance, what she was allowed to want, This was the thing she had not known she needed until he offered it, and it turned out to be rather large. In the library, she found the Montclair family record and spent 3 full afternoons with it. She found her grandmother's name in a marriage entry from 50 years ago. She found the running stag in a land grant from the Eastern Territories, the same stag that had been in red wax on the sealed letter in the bottom of her mother's sewing chest. She found, in the margin of a chronicle, a notation in an unattributed hand about Helena Rose Montclair that read, "Steady and particular." She sat with those 3 words for a long time. Steady and particular. Yes, that was what she had been. That was what she had given her daughter without knowing she was giving it, or perhaps knowing perfectly well. The ring came 6 months after the proceedings concluded, in the garden, in the clear cold of early winter, when the topiary birds wore snow and the fountain had frozen over and the moon threw silver across the same ground it had silvered on the night Elara had stood in the gallery, reaching for a gilded frame. Caspian had not planned the garden deliberately. She told him afterward about the moon and the gallery and the symmetry of it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned to read as him recalibrating, and then he said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life finding that out about you, aren't I?" "Almost certainly," she said. The ring was not the signet ring she had left on the receiving hall table. It was smaller, quieter, personal in the way that signet rings could never be. A deep red garnet set in gold, the same shade as the rubies in the portrait. He had had it made from a sketch she had made of her mother's painted necklace, which she had given him one afternoon in the library without explanation, and which he had taken without asking for one. He had understood what it was for. She said yes before he had finished asking. He pointed this out. She told him he had used up his allotted suspense 8 years ago. He laughed and put the ring on her finger, and she held it up in the winter moonlight and looked at the deep red of the garnet against the snow white of the garden and thought about her mother in rubies and felt the long, particular ache of a grief that had not gone anywhere and never would, but had made room, had been making room all along, quietly, without her noticing, for something to live alongside it. "I understand now. I understand what you gave me and what you kept and what it cost. I am angry about some of it, and always will be, and I loved you and always will, and both of those things are true at the same time, and I think you knew they would be. I think you were steady and particular enough to know that too." She had stood for a long time in the room that had been her mother's and looked at the window that looked out over the back garden, which in spring was still faintly purple with lavender, that had self-seeded for years beyond anyone's tending of it, and she had said, to the empty room, to the person who was no longer in it, but who had been in it for 22 years of quiet and careful love. She had visited Greyvale in the spring of the year following. She had gone to the small house with the lavender boxes, which a neighbor had been tending in the years since Helena died, because it seemed like the kind of thing Helena would have wanted continued. She had walked through the rooms she had grown up in and touched the things she had grown up alongside. The kitchen table, the pantry jars with their precise left-handed labels, the sewing chest at the bottom of which the letter had waited 3 years to be found. She kept it, not as a title, not as a formal designation, but in the way she signed her private letters and the way she thought of herself in quiet moments. She kept it the way she kept the habit of folding her hands, left over right. Some things are not titles or inheritances. Some things are simply yours, given to you by someone who loved you before you knew you needed anything. Crown Princess Elara Ashford, née Montclair, the registry read. Formerly known as Elara Voss, the name given for safety in a small house in Greyvale, the name her mother had placed on her like a cloak in the years when names were the only armor available. The portrait now hung in the private sitting room she shared with Caspian, between 2 windows that faced east, not in a locked gallery, not in a room opened only by one man's private choosing. In the morning light, Helena Rose Montclair in her crimson gown and her rubies, left hand folded over right, her face turned very slightly toward the window, as though she was paying attention to something outside and might, if asked, have quite a great deal to say about it. Elara sat with her coffee in the mornings and looked at her mother and thought, "I found it. I found all of it. I came to this palace with a letter I couldn't read and a name rattling in my pocket, and I stood in a room full of gilded frames, and I knew your face the way I knew my own hands, and everything that came after. The documents and the evidence and the long night and the room full of power and the man who chose to know, all of it began with that. Left over right, always. The heart keeps its own kind of registry. It records the things that matter whether or not the official books agree. It holds the true names of people even when those names have been removed from every formal record that exists. It does not require a notary's seal, a royal herald, or a formal pronouncement before a full court to know what it knows. She thought her mother would have had something extremely precise to say about all of it, about the compound and the forged signature and the cracked smile, about the registry pressed into a messenger's hands in a provincial market square by a woman who knew she was running out of time, about the 8 months in the linen rooms and the 900 introductions and the 4 minutes in the East Wing corridor on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought her mother would have said, in the dry particular voice she used when it was only the two of them, "That one, the one who counted the minutes." She thought her mother would have been right. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of Elara's hand reaching toward that portrait in the gallery and could not look away, if the 7 pages of left-handed writing did something to your chest, if the moment Caspian went down on one knee in front of the full court caught you somewhere you weren't entirely prepared for, then you already understand what this kind of storytelling is for. These are stories about the truths that it buried, and the people who refuse to let them stay buried, about the love that moves quietly, that carries proof rather than promises, that chooses to know rather than to look away, about the moment a woman who has been told for her whole life that she is nothing turns to a room full of power and says, "This is what I want, and it is not your title, and it is not your name. It is my mother's story spoken aloud by the people who erased it. There are more of them. There will always be more." The king watched from the front pew with the expression of a man who has decided that the best thing he has done in a complicated reign was to look at his 17-year-old son with a church registry and say, "If you believe it matters, pursue it." He had not, in fact, said that. He had been a great deal more ambivalent than that for a great many years. But Elara decided, watching his face during the ceremony, that the version of history she intended to keep was the one in which he had, and she kept it. Caspian held her hands during the ceremony. Both of them, warmly, with the kind of grip that is not performative. Not the formal clasping of two public figures completing a rite, but the straightforward holding of someone who has been working toward this exact moment for a very long time and is not going to manage it at any distance greater than this. She felt the warmth of it, the way she had felt the warmth of the pre-dawn fire in the room where he had first sat across from her and told her the truth, as something real, grounded, not a performance of itself. She thought, "You could not be erased. You are here in this chapel in every fold of my hands. You are here in everything I know how to notice." She wore the garnet ring on her right hand and the wedding band on her left, and she thought about left hands throughout the ceremony in the way that the mind will fix on small particular things when it is processing something too large to take in all at once. She thought about her mother's left hand and the letters and the labels and the forgery that had been its own kind of inadvertent tribute. A forger so certain of their own certainty that they had not thought to learn the handedness of the woman they were erasing. The wedding was held in the palace chapel in the early autumn, on a day when the light came through the tall windows at a low golden angle that made everything in the room look like the inside of a very old painting. Elara had chosen the chapel over the grand receiving hall because the chapel was smaller, and she was not yet done with small intimate things, and perhaps she never would be entirely, which was a quality Caspian told her, with great sincerity, that he intended to respect for the rest of his life. Subscribe, and be here when the next one begins. Every new story arrives for the people who stayed, the ones who watched all the way to the end, who felt every moment of the portrait and the letter and the left-handed signature and the 900 introductions that never made it past 3 words. Leave a comment and tell us. What was the moment that broke your heart the most? Was it the portrait, the letter on the 7th page, the apothecary's record, or was it the 4 minutes in the storage room doorway, a man standing in the dark, counting the seconds until she turned the corner? What would you have done with that ring on the table? What would you have said first? Every comment is read, every single one. And every person who takes a moment to write something down is, in their own quiet way, doing exactly what Elara did, refusing to let a story pass without leaving a record that someone was here, and it mattered, and they felt every word. Welcome. We are so glad you stayed.